Welcome to this, the last in our 2024 election briefings from the Religion Media Centre. To date, we've been looking at issues that concern religious organisations such as poverty, refugees, climate change and education. And today we're looking at how the incoming government will take note of these concerns and what kind of relationship faith groups should have with the new government. Joining us, we have a number of guests on the call who already do liaise with the government and have ideas about what should happen in the future, and some who are looking for guidance in that regard from the politicians on the call. So we're going to start with the politicians, and we're going to start with Sir Stephen Timms, the chair of the all-party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society. Thank you very much for joining us, Stephen, in the last week of this campaign. And I know you probably know lots of people on the call. People will know you. You've championed this cause for many years, but it seems to be turbocharged in the last campaign by this letter from Sir Keir Starmer, in which he promises strong partnerships with faith communities. Tell us the plan. What will you do to ensure strong partnerships?
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me and for setting up this very helpful session. I think the approach which Keir Starmer has set out in that letter, which was circulated on the 10th of June, reflects the fact that Labour's approach has been very profoundly altered, I think, by our experience of what's happened over the last few years, particularly in the pandemic, but also in the cost of living crisis since then. And just to quote from the letter, Keir makes this point: through years of austerity, a global pandemic, overseas conflicts, and a cost of living crisis, our faith groups have served with resilience and compassion. And I think that observation has changed the way the Labour Party, and therefore an incoming Labour government, if one is elected on Thursday, is thinking about the resources that faith groups bring in looking at the future of the country. And Keir Starmer has set out these 5 missions in our manifesto, and he's made clear that we want faith groups to be partners, and we need faith groups to be partners if we're going to deliver on those missions and achieve what we think is needed. And so Keir's letter goes on: given the opportunity to serve, a mission-led Labour government would ensure strong partnerships with faith communities, harnessing your energy and creativity to renew our country. To help us do this, we would firstly appoint a government minister to lead on engagement with faith communities. Secondly, engage faith-based organisations in the delivery of these 5 missions. And thirdly, promote local faith covenants to facilitate partnerships between local authorities and faith groups in communities. And I'd be very happy to talk more about any of those 3 items, but I think those are the 3 key things that we want to do. I also want to add this point, that when I was a minister in the Labour governments before 2010, we used to have the Faith Communities Consultative Council. That was scrapped in the early years of the coalition. I never really knew why, and it's never been replaced. There's never been, since the FCCC was abolished, a place for faith groups and the government to sit down and talk. And then earlier this year, the government took a decision which I thought was extraordinarily foolish. They removed all the funding from the Interfaith Network. So the Interfaith Network has been forced to announce its closure at a time when I think everybody can see we need interfaith dialogue. We need people of different faiths to be talking together and to be working together more than ever, given what's happening around the world.
Will you reconstitute the Interfaith Network? Will you give it its money back?
There's no commitment to refund that organisation, but I think we definitely will want, and I will certainly be pressing very hard for an incoming Labour government, if one is elected, to ensure the capacity is there for that dialogue to be resumed and maintained and built on. And I just wanted to quote final sentence from Keir's letter. He says, in addition, in a time of worrying polarisation and division, I want to reassure you that a Labour government would be committed to building a Britain where all faith communities are safe and where diversity is celebrated. And for me, that does include making sure there is capacity for interfaith collaboration and dialogue.
Well, I know there'll be questions later about how the nuts and bolts of that and how that will work. But just to introduce the other politicians on the call, can I go to Lord Jim Wallace next from the Liberal Democrats? Now, having heard that detailed exposition of how Labour will work with faith groups, do you think the Liberal Democrats have missed a trick in not asking Ed Davey to write his own letter to all the faith leaders promising the same thing?
It would have been, but I mean, no one's going to suggest seriously that the Liberal Democrats are going to be in office after Thursday. But what we would want to do, and I think what Ed would certainly commit to, is to build good relationships with different faith communities, and not least encourage our local, because very often we are in office at a local government level, for local government for councils, councillors, to build up relationships within their own community, because I think we recognise that very often it is the faith communities in different ways can bring real experience to the table. Certainly during the pandemic, that was the case. I mean, many churches actually, and other non-Christian organisations too, have been sponsoring food banks. I mean, they know the reality in many communities as to what the issues are, not least with regard to poverty, welcoming refugees, and therefore I think there's huge value in properly engaging with faith groups in the community. And I've no doubt that at a national level, if there's particular consultations, if the particular issues come up, I know that my colleagues would want to engage with the faith communities to get their input. If there's consultations, to know what their input is.
And we will be talking about that, the formal mechanisms that exist and how they can be perhaps built on. But finally, in this trio at the top of this session, can I go to Colin Bloom? Colin, you were the former government faith engagement advisor, and thank you very much for stepping in the absence of a serving Conservative politician at the moment. But I'm wondering, as you've heard those initial comments from Stephen Timms and Lord Wallace, whether you think that what they've done is nick your ideas. Because in the review that you wrote when you left your position, you advocated for a faith engagement advisor. You advocated for closer relations between all the groups. You pointed out the challenges. So have they nicked your ideas is the question.
I hope so. That would be lovely. Look, I should say I don't speak for the Conservative Party, and I have had nothing to do with the Conservative Party since I left, or since I retired from my role last year, early last year. So my report was published last Easter. It will be whoever forms the next government, and that's almost certainly going to be Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party.
Let's talk about what you hope will happen in relations between faith groups and the next government. What is your vision?
Well, I would love to see the re-emergence of things like the roundtables that I set up during COVID, where we had many of the people who are on this call from different faiths joined and were able to contribute in a meaningful way. There were ministers and secretaries of state also involved in those. The problem that the government had was, as soon as COVID was over, I think these were really excellent roundtables where, serious engagement took place between government and places of worship and people of faith. And what happened was, well, as soon as COVID was not over, but, as soon as the government felt they could move on, their view was, and the civil service largely led this as well, was, well, we've got nothing else to say to them, so what's the point of them? And it was missing the trick. For me, what would the value of them was, this was a two-way conversation. This was about faith leaders and leaders of places of worship and senior and serious national faith leaders coming together to discuss not just the closure of places of worship for COVID or the reopening of places of worship or safe use of places of worship, but it was so many other things. So yes, in my report, there is a very clear recommendation that we have a faith champion, or a faith czar, if you like, something like that, who doesn't, who isn't necessarily political, but is bilingual, can speak both fluent politics, fluent government, and fluent faith. And it's a bit like a children's commissioner. We have a children's commissioner. We have a justice commissioner. We have a czar for this and that. The fact that faith doesn't have one is a massive oversight.
Thanks very much indeed. And all three of you, do listen to what the panelists have to say, and do jump in and come in when you want to just put your hand up. But we're going to go to some of our guests on the call today, and we're going to start by trying to get some stories and working out what exactly is going on the ground at the moment, how faith groups are liaising with national and local government and what they're achieving, what difference they're making in society. And we've got three speakers here to talk about this. Daniel Singleton, the National Executive Director of Faith Action. And you also do this, you are the Secretariat for the APPG on Faith and Society. Amrit Singh Ubi, the Director of Civic Engagement and Partnerships at the Nishkam Civic Association Covenant Scheme in the West Midlands. And Jack Palmer-White, the Senior Director of the Good Faith Partnership and Project Director of Church Works Commission. I mean, it may be a surprise for people that there are so many of you, so many organisations dealing with faith groups doing good work around the country. But Daniel, can we start with you? Do you want some examples of what you're actually doing?
Our particular focus has been on health. So we've got a partnership. We're part of the Health and Wellbeing Alliance. And as well as the parliamentary work in terms of the APPG, part of the way this is with health programs. We saw, and Colin's already spoken about, the particular power of bringing faith involvement into government responses to particular issues. And we saw that over COVID. What we've seen since then is it's like public health departments have suddenly realized, hey, a great way to reach people is through faith groups. So we're running a number of programs in partnership with local authorities and local health organizations to use that reach, particularly around the whole area of health inequalities. So we've got a number of things going on in East London where local faith groups are setting up particular programs. It may be on weight loss, maybe on smoking or different things like that, or even English language acquisition and how that feeds into health literacy as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Turning now to Jack Palmer-White, Senior Director of the Good Faith Partnership and Project Director of the Church Works Commission. Can you tell us a little bit more, Jack, about the work that you do?
Church Works is an entity that was set up by senior church leaders through all of the mainline Christian denominations in the shadow of COVID, recognizing a lot of what sort of has already been said about the role that faith communities and churches played in helping to respond in local communities and also at the national level, and recognizing actually that when government has the opportunity to speak directly to churches corporately, not just individually, the impact of those conversations, the trust that's built, and the action that comes out of that is far greater than having individual siloed conversations. We particularly focus on three massive issues: mental health and well-being, vulnerable children and families, and tackling poverty, and finding practical ways that churches that are already working on these issues can connect what they're doing in local communities with broader public policy goals. Probably the best and most inspiring example of that is the Warm Welcome campaign. So the Warm Welcome campaign was emerged from a conversation between church leaders, between former Prime Minister Gordon Brown and a number of key Christian anti-poverty charities, as the cost of living, cost of energy crisis in 2022 was really coming to the fore. And the church is saying, we need to urgently respond. What can we do? What are the assets that we bring to this? And quickly recognize its people and its places. And so over the last 2 winters, churches have led the way and other faith communities in offering over 10,000 warm welcome spaces across the country in churches, in mosques, and expanding into libraries, community centres, theatres, pubs, coordinated by a central campaign team, which is based out of Good Faith Partnership. What's amazing about that is we've seen 4.5 million visits to those spaces, 100,000 visitors a week, £3 million in micro grants given out to local spaces by the campaign centrally to support them to run those spaces.
Thank you very much for all that information. Can we move on to Amrit Singh Ubi? Amrit, you're the Director of Civic Engagement and Partnerships at the Nishkam Civic Association in Birmingham. Just tell us something about the work that you do on the ground, please.
Thank you, Ruth. Let me give you an example of what we do here and how we're structured here. We have 5 centres here, 5 centres of excellence. We have the place of worship, the Gurdwara. We have the Nishkam School Trust. We have the Nishkam Health Trust. We have the Civic Engagement Centre where I sit, the Nishkam Centre, and we have a community cooperative. Now, let's put those into political terms for colleagues on the table. We have a faith centre. We have an education centre. We have a health centre. We have a partnerships and engagement centre for cohesion, tackling injustice, tackling inequalities, and building bridges. And we have an employment centre. So basically, we have a micro government structure here for engaging with all those different tentacles, where we're able to look at what are the issues that are affecting society locally. And please don't read this as serving the Sikh community. This is serving the community, the whole population of Handsworth, Birmingham, and in my role as the chair of the Faith Street Partnership Group sitting within the Combined Authority, the region. So whether it's cost of living, energy crises, refugees, hate crime, mental health and inequalities, social injustice, housing, we should be playing that active part and being the voice on the ground for local politicians to say, actually, we know who's got a solution. We know who's got an answer. Let's go to COVID. COVID was a wake-up call. COVID exposed so much that was wrong in the way we administer democracy, the way we sign up to democracy, and where the power really sits within that structure. The power was very clearly in the power of the people. It was the people who stepped up, the faith communities, the community groups, the volunteer sector stepped up and did some amazing work. We spoke about the Faith Covenant. The Faith Covenant is a vehicle. It is only going to be as powerful and as good as how much support it gets from the centre and how faith is recognised as a key player rather than an afterthought.
Thank you. Thanks. And can we keep talking about the covenants? Because they are covenants which were set up, as I understand it, or pioneered by Faith Action. And you've signed one in the West Midlands. You were the first regional authority to do it, weren't you, Amrit? And what happens? You sign a piece of paper. Faith groups all get together. They sign a piece of paper. What does it commit each side to do?
You're absolutely right, Ruth. And I don't wish to rub Daniel's or other colleagues' noses in it, but we were first on 2 accounts. Birmingham was the first faith covenant signed in the country in 2014. And last year, the first region as part of the Combined Authority to sign up to the faith covenant. So 2 major firsts. What is the covenant? The covenant is a great vehicle to promote dialogue. It's like it saves you going on a blind date, so you know what you're expecting from each other. You know what you're walking into. So there's expectations, there's discussion. Let me give you a nuts and bolts example, if I may, colleagues. We did some work through the Nishkam Health Group, and just based on where we sit, 93% of our community comes from minority organizations. We sit within 1.6% of the most deprived area in the country, where half of the population, adult population, and half of the children's population, child population, is below the poverty line. By offering a service in collaboration with Birmingham Solihull Mental Health Trust and a small pump-primed initiative, we've kept that initiative going for over 3-4 years, even without funding because people see the value of it. They've donated, they've given time, they've given energy. And over a year, we had 500 sessions of counseling on a mental health project. And just like Jack said earlier, the results were absolutely amazing. There was a 39% improvement in depression, a 38% improvement in anxiety. So community groups, faith groups offer far more bang for their buck than we're going to get elsewhere. So it's about collaborative approach. It's about how we do that together. Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah. Thank you. And I know in the Labour Party letter from Sir Keir Starmer, Stephen, he seeks to promote local faith covenants to facilitate partnerships. So will we see an expansion of those or a push by amongst local governments to persuade them to sign into covenants? Is that what's going to happen?
Yes, I think it is. I really welcome that commitment. As Amrit said, the Faith Covenant goes back to 2014, and City of Birmingham and associated faith groups, including AMRIC, were the first group to sign the covenant. I was there as chair of the all-party parliamentary group as well, and with Daniel Singleton at Faith Action, we've promoted this idea over the last 10 years. But what was really interesting for me was, historically, there's been quite a reluctance on the part of local councils to work with faith groups. I think because there's been a bit of a fear that it's all very complicated. If I talk to this group over here, am I going to offend this other group over there? Aren't they really just interested in trying to convert people? Or if they are providing a service, isn't it going to be biased in favour of their members of their particular group? But then in the pandemic, suddenly every council in the country was working with faith groups in their area because it turned out in reality there wasn't anybody else. There was nothing comparable to the network, the trust that the faith groups had, the presence in every community, the reach to those who most needed help, that faith groups were able to step up and meet the need in a way that nobody else could. So I think that's led to a much more supportive perspective on this. And I'm delighted that Keir Starmer wants to take that forward.
Can we go back a step, really, and find out how it's possible for faith groups to get into speaking to the government and addressing the needs that they can see amongst their own communities? There are formal mechanisms, and we're joined by Richard Chapman, Head of Parliamentary Affairs at the Church of England, and Marie Southall, Director of Partnership and Public Affairs at the Catholic Bishops' Conference. What are the kind of traditional routes that already exist for the Church of England and the Catholic Church to bring their representations to the government? Do you have diaried meetings? How does it work? Richard, perhaps you could start.
Obviously, Church of England is the established church and therefore is accountable to Parliament and has a Second Estates Commissioner in Parliament who is an MP appointed by the governing party. They answer for the Church of England, but they also have a role in, I suppose, communicating, facilitating with government. There are Lords Spiritual who sit in the House of Lords as individual Lords of Parliament. They're not there as representatives, in inverted commas, of the Church of England, but they also have opportunity to access conversations with ministers and engage with government across the range. So there are structural arrangements because of establishment with the Church of England, which brings us into contact. There are also and Marie may want to say something about this as well, because the Church of England educates 1 million children, and a quarter of all primary schools are Church of England schools. Church of England's the single biggest provider of academies. We have a serious stake in delivery on the area of education. So maintaining good links in with the Department for Education is important. We also have 1,000 chaplains working in schools, prisons, the armed forces. And the Church of England is responsible for 12,500, I think it is, listed buildings. Something like 45% of Grade 1 listed buildings in England are Church of England.
How easy is it for you, because of your established links, to pick up the phone? If a bishop calls you and says, we've got a real problem with, refugees in a certain part of the country, do you just pick up the phone? Can you do that?
It doesn't quite work like that. I think we do have connections with certain civil servants in certain departments. And so, my reason for explaining our stake in society was to say that, our relations with, say, DCMS, with the Home Office, to a certain extent, the Foreign Office, given the Anglican Communion, are perhaps more embedded, stronger, been there for longer than our connections with other departments. All of this is down to relationship. We have bishops who have organized themselves voluntarily as leads on particular areas. So for instance, immigration and asylum, the Bishop of Southwark is our lead bishop, will take the lead in negotiations or engagement with government on those issues. So if in your scenario we had that kind of issue, we might get in touch with the Bishop of Southwark. He may want to speak to the House of Lords minister.
What you're describing is a kind of well-oiled machine that already exists. And is it the same for you, Marie, with the Catholic Church?
It's slightly different in that I think our relationship with different government departments is a bit more varied. So in the same way the Church of England, we'd work quite closely with the Department for Education. Within the DfE, there's a whole team designed to work with us and other faith school providers, civil servants who are permanently there regardless of ministerial changes and government changes. And that makes those kind of ironing out of practical difficulties much easier. Where there are issues of concern to our community, but the government doesn't seem so interested in our position, we're the same as anyone else. We're trying to get a meeting with a minister, writing letters in the way that any other interest group would do so. So I'd say we've got a mixed and varied relationship. We've got good relationships with the government where they can see the advantage of a partnership, and less good relationships with bits of government where they don't see what value we could add to their work.
Interesting. Can we expand that and bring in Phil Champagne next, and then Professor Adila Shafi to talk about how other faith groups could get a look into the wheels of government and represent their own community's view. Phil Champagne, you've started this new initiative, the Faith and Belief Policy Collective. What's the issue that you're trying to address there? And what would you like to say to the politicians on the call at the moment about what you would like to see happen in the new government?
Thanks for the opportunity to say a few words about the Faith and Belief Policy Collective. I think it's been interesting to listen to other speakers, and particularly to pick up on maybe something said by Colin and Stephen. But I think obviously the first thing is to say is that, why did we sort of work on this initiative? And I think it's been kind of already said that we don't have to labour the point that we're at a critical time in our society with numerous big challenges and crises, from climate change to social polarisation, NHS, the cost of living crisis, etc. And I think, the principles and values that are inherent in all faith and belief traditions are really important to tap into when we are trying to find solutions to these challenges, in the same way that, they were very important in the establishment of the welfare state after the Second World War.
Yeah, I suppose the question is, Phil, how will this be done? What's your vision about how conversations could take place with the new government that include more groups?
We need to recognise now, it's sort of maybe stating the obvious, but our society now is very variegated and diverse in terms of faith and belief groups, increasingly so. And I think there's a lot of being said at the moment about engaging with faith and belief communities. The question is how, and how does that happen? The fact that we've issued a letter from voices in the faith and belief sector is indicative of one attempt to send a letter the other way back. This is a two-way process. Colin and Stephen have been both saying, and Daniel, this is kind of about a two-way dialogue. But how do you set that up in a meaningful way when we're such a diverse group and sector in terms of faith and belief? So we need to sit down and talk that through. It may be roundtables that Colin mentions. It may be a sort of reimagining the consultative council of faith that Stephen mentioned. But we need to really put our heads on. I don't think it's faith leaders necessarily that Colin said, because there's a lot of work. We need to tap into what's happening locally. We know that we need to have more women engaged in these policy discussions. We know that we need young people's voices. So it's not an obvious answer here. What I would welcome, and what the Faith and Belief Policy Collective would welcome, is designing that process in a way that can hold some legitimacy and hold the interests of such a diverse and variegated sector. And it's not going to be an easy task, but we need to sit down and think that through. One idea that I heard the other day was that, it may be good to have sort of futures units or something like that, where you have groups working on different policy areas. And we need faith and belief representation in those groups, so that we can harness, as Amrit was saying, the capacities of faith and belief communities, not just as a sticking plaster or emergency response after COVID, but in a way that can actually inform and enrich policy discussions. But it's not going to be easy.
No, thank you very much. Can I bring in Professor Adila Shafi at this point? This is about representation of the Muslim community at the highest levels of government, speaking to government on these issues.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm speaking on behalf of the Bristol Muslim Strategic Leadership Group. So whilst I talk on represent a more local organisation, our role is really to work with the city's leaders to tap into local government. However, there's no real mechanism for us, certainly at the local level, to tap into central government. And certainly Muslim communities have felt never more alienated and ostracised by governments, particularly the current government, than ever before. And potentially with the incoming government too. There's much work that needs to be done to rebuild some of that trust and some of those relationships. For example, the government has not really engaged with, for example, an umbrella organisation like the Muslim Council of Britain, but there are others too, where there's no real seat at the table for Muslim organisations to speak with government and vice versa. So I again speak for a local Muslim organisation, but we are connected, and our highest level of being able to connect with government is through organisations like the Muslim Council of Britain, where we are an affiliate organisation. Without that sort of structure, there's no way for us to feed anything into anything that looks close to central government. So I guess my question to the politicians on here is, and we've heard a lot about it, is what specific things are going to happen? We have no real way of talking. All we do is get one-sided talk, and there's a big vacuum in the middle. Perhaps it is roundtables, perhaps it's other formal ways of engagement, but there's nothing coming through to us here at local levels or even nationally as a network across the Muslim community that the government is doing to engage with us.
Let's put that question to Stephen Timms. Will you start talking to the Muslim Council of Britain?
Yes, I think the ban on talking to the Muslim Council of Britain is absolutely absurd, and it's been in place for ever since 2010. There was a ridiculous episode a few years ago when Penny Mordaunt happened to bump into the General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain, had a chat with her somewhere, and she got hauled over the coals for having done it. And indeed, the reason for withdrawing all the funding for the Interfaith Network was because one of its 22 trustees was somebody connected with the Muslim Council of Britain. Ridiculous. I mean, obviously the government doesn't always have to agree with the Muslim Council of Britain, but they certainly should be talking to it. And I'm confident that a new government will do that. In terms of how this will be structured, I think what will happen is these 5 missions that have been set out in the Labour manifesto, there will be cross-government ministerial and official structures set up to take forward each of the 5 missions, and we will need to involve civil society and faith and belief group representatives alongside those to make sure there is a proper dialogue about each of them about how the mission can best be delivered.
So my question would be, yes, it is absolutely absurd. There's absolutely no doubt about that, because how do organisations like ours here locally in Bristol doing our thing have any way to reach government and what's happening at our level? And how do you reach us as well if you're not going to do it through, for example, an umbrella organisation like the Muslim Council of Britain? I never understood why that is the case. I'm not saying that they're the only organisation by any means. There are others, but if so, who are those others, and how can someone like me at a local level, who's got grassroots into Muslims in Bristol, all sort of 35,000 of us here, how do you reach us, and how do I reach you on behalf of them?
There's a missing link. One of the particular missing links could be the Member of Parliament, a local Member of Parliament. I mean, I can hear what's said. I think I remember earlier this year, towards the end of last year, there was a briefing to Liberal Democrat peers from the Muslim Council of Britain, so we could get a better understanding of what the issues were that were causing concerns, and it was a good exchange. But I mean, it's also probably the case that the individual parish priest in Bristol doesn't have immediate access to government and has to go through a bishop of the Church of England. But you've all got access to your local Member of Parliament, and Stephen and I both have been, or Stephen, hopefully I'm sure will want to be a Member of Parliament after Thursday. I've been a Member of Parliament. And there's no substitute for actually getting these views first hand from your constituents who know the patch, and you know what they put into it. So I would say, Adila, don't hold back in contacting your members of Parliament. That is the most proximate link you have, and use them to get access and put your points further up the line.
I think there does need to be a channel into government as well. I think that's a very strong lesson from the pandemic, that the faith groups stepped up and took on an enormous burden on behalf of all of us. And there are lots of really good ideas in mosques, in churches, synagogues, and people do want to make a contribution. But at the moment, there isn't anywhere where they can find out how to do it. And that, I think, will be a key role for this minister proposed in Keir Starmer's letter, so that anybody can approach that office and say, we've got this idea, we think we can help with this, and be at least pointed in the right direction to know where to start.
Thank you. Can I just move on to a different topic now? I think we have Daniel from Open Doors on the line.
Open Doors is lucky to be quite established within Parliament. We worked very closely with the last government and hope to work very closely with whoever wins on Thursday. Stephen Timms, obviously, we've worked closely with, who's here, and glad to see him here. One of the results of some of the last government's work has been the Bishop of Truro review. And lots of recommendations from that have been implemented. And one of the recommendations that has at least begun to be implemented is the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Freedom of Religion or Belief, aptly filled by Lord Ahmed and Raymond Shisti, and most recently Fiona Bruce. And we really hope that whoever comes in next will reinstitute this, possibly even reintroduce Fiona Bruce's private members bill as was, rather than, there's some suggestion from some parties that there might be maybe a watering down of the mandate or an adding on to the mandate, something like fraud and human rights. And I think that's a concern not only for us, but for other organisations in the Forbes space. So I wonder, maybe Stephen can speak to that.
Well, I hope so too. I was one of the signatories to Fiona Bruce's bill on this, which unfortunately fell because of the early dissolution of Parliament. There isn't a commitment in the manifesto, but it is something that I've talked at some length to David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, about, and I very much hope that the envoy role will be maintained if a Labour government is elected on Thursday.
Who do you think would be best placed to reintroduce that, maybe even as a private member's bill?
Oh, I don't know. Well, I mean, I'm sure Fiona is seeking re-election, so maybe it's something that she could bring forward again. The key thing is to make sure that there is an envoy in place. I think the legislation is helpful, but it isn't essential. What is essential, I think, is getting the envoy.
Yes, and there is a specific commitment from the Tories to make that a statutory role, and but nothing, as far as I can see, for Labour. For the Liberal Democrats, just to put this to you, Lord Wallace, what it says is that this is the one, the ambassador role. You want to appoint an ambassador-level champion for freedom of belief, missing out the world religion, which is what we usually know it as. And I wonder what the idea behind that was.
I haven't a clue. And thank you for drawing it to my attention. I'll be honest, I actually don't think it shouldn't really be any distinction, because beliefs can embrace religion. I suppose it actually goes wider than religion, because I think there's been some of the comments in chat about people who have beliefs that are not immediately badged as religion. And therefore, I don't think we should be exclusive. And I would hope that is an approach that would include religion, but would also include other beliefs that wouldn't necessarily badge themselves as religion. And I think there's a lot of work to do. I think I said earlier, I thought Lord Ahmed did a good, was approachable. I was sometimes disappointed, however, that tough action wasn't taken where there was clear breaches of people's religious beliefs and persecution.
We're drawing to a close now, but one quick-fire question for you, Stephen, is will you lift the 50% cap on faith school admissions, as the Tories have promised to do?
There isn't a commitment in our manifesto to do that. I don't think that is a commitment that we're taking into the election.
Okay, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So I've got a final question for all three of you, Stephen Timms, Lord Jim Wallace, and Colin, if you're still here, Colin Bloom. There's a great deal of agreement amongst all of you about including faith groups in the discussion. I wonder, what are the clear blue, red or orange lines that divide you, that mark you out as different from the other groups in your approach to how a political party should deal with and relate to faith groups?
I think support for this approach is distinctive to the Labour Party in this election. As we've been reminded, the Conservatives are not here, appear to not have an interest in this area at all. And I think that is a distinctive in this election. Another thing that we've done is set up a network of faith champions over the last couple of years, an initiative Keir Starmer launched at Labour Party conference a couple of years ago to designate individual members of Parliament to relate to specific faith communities and improve the dialogue in that way. I really welcome this development, and I'm disappointed the Conservatives have kind of turned their back on it, but I think it's the right way forward.
I think it's the importance of inclusion. It's the importance of being able to consult, being able to take on board different views. And I don't necessarily, from the comments I've heard today from a number of sources, there was very little, if anything, that I really disagreed with. I think I would be very wary of any political party saying that God is on their side and no one else's. And I think there's a lot of strength, as I'm sure Stephen will agree from his experience in Parliament, that working together across parties and engaging with faith groups across parties is probably the most effective way of going forward. Fine if there's a minister there and the future government takes a more proactive view than has been the case in the recent past. That's positive, that's a good thing, but equally it shouldn't diminish the efforts we made among us all. And my experience as when I was a member of the House of Commons was that there was much more issues and much more things shared by people who were of faith and religion than was necessarily divided us from in terms of our party political views.
I've got no reason to disagree with anything that either Stephen or Jim has said. I think it is disappointing that the Conservative Party haven't put anybody up to this. I mean, as I said earlier, I don't speak for them, and I'm not involved with them anymore. Although ideologically, I am on the centre right. so that is a big disappointment. But I think I've always found, and I've been operating in this space for 15 years, I suppose, or more. That there is an awful lot of cross-party support and affection and and interest and encouragement on matters of faith. My biggest takeaway in terms of working for the last 5 prime ministers in one way or another is if you've got a prime minister or a secretary of state or a minister who's intellectually curious enough to ask the right questions, then you will find certain other doors will open. And if you've got one that's kind of closed off to it, doesn't understand faith, is frightened of faith, or is in some way antagonistic towards certain key faiths, then the wheel falls off. And my plea to Keir Starmer or whoever is the next prime minister is to have people around them that are curious, intellectually curious, and substantial individuals that can make sure that the faith dialogue continues.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for taking part. And that's the end of our election briefing series.